Here today, I am, first off, that was actually my fault about the first year thing. I need to update that bio, so don't blame Chris, that was my fault. But so I am here to talk about a topic that is very near and dear to my heart, and that is the topic of intermittent fasting. And it is not only interesting to me because I work in a lab specifically geared around intermittent fasting. It's because it was the topic of my thesis, and right now hopefully going to be the topic of my dissertation as well. And it's one of the reasons I actually decided to come out here to Texas Tech to study with Dr. Tinsley, because we are one of the few labs really in the US focusing a ton on intermittent fasting. So hopefully today we can kind of go through, answer this actual question here of what is intermittent fasting? Should you be fasting or should you be feasting? So with that, let's get going. Now, since this is a talk around intermittent fasting, first thing we got to do is everybody's got to get on the same page about what is intermittent fasting. There's a lot of misconceptions out there. If you go on, good old YouTube's, Twitter's, internet, so whatever social media, you're gonna see a lot of weird things out there about what is intermittent fasting, what it is, what it isn't, what it does for you, what it doesn't do for you, all these different fun things. So hopefully we can kind of dispel some of those myths and then just get on the same page about what it is. Then we're gonna dive into some of the papers, specifically papers regarding intermittent fasting and resistance training, because I am team #NoCardio, all resistance training all the time. And going to start off with its effects on body composition and more specifically fat loss. And then after we talk about intermittent fasting and fat loss, we'll spend some time talking about, are you going to be able to gain muscle? What could potentially intermittent fasting actually help you gain muscle? Well, stay tuned. We'll answer that question and more. And then lastly, kind of hopefully tie it up in a nice little bow for you so you can take it with you whenever you're talking to clients, friends, family, students, whoever it may be. You can speak from a place of knowledge about this, and because especially with how it's getting popular nowadays, anyone finds out you have any kind of background in this topic's gonna come up. So with that, what is intermittent fasting? That is the grand question. Well, despite what most people think, intermittent fasting is actually this very broad term that encompasses a multitude of fasting protocols. However, all these different fasting protocols have one main commonality, that they split whatever period into two distinct periods. So a fasting period and a feeding period, and both of them are very defined periods of time. Now, the fasting period sounds exactly just like what it is. No calories consumed. Now, it can vary depending whether you're doing a dry fast or a wet fast. For instance, a dry fast, that even includes no liquids. And you may see that, and we see that more in religious fasting, or actually some laboratory testing. Like for instance, when we do body composition assessments in our lab, we always use a dry fast. But in terms of intermittent fasting, what's more common is a wet fast. So you can still have you can still have liquids, just liquids that aren't calorie containing. So the water, diet soda, black coffee, all that good stuff. And the thing with fasting, the fasting period, is this can range anywhere from hours to days. So some of the more moderate protocols, we may only see this last anywhere from like 12 hours-ish, but some of the more extreme protocols, you'll actually have people fasting for days on end. Now, then the feeding window, again, just exactly kind of what it sounds like. This is where the participant is consuming all their calories, whether it's food calories, liquid calories, whatever it might be. And now this is a question that I get a lot about intermittent fasting. And that is, well, I'm intermittent fasting, but can I do this with keto? Can I do this with paleo, vegan, low fat, whatever version of the millions of diets there are out there? And the answer is always yes, because we have to keep in mind, intermittent fasting, all we're doing is changing when the person eats, not what they eat. IF says nothing about what the person eats. Now we'll talk a little bit about some recommendations, especially for some various macronutrients that you might want to focus on. But in general, all it's saying is eat from this time to this time. Don't eat from this time to this time. But what you eat in that window, that's all you do you. Now, like I mentioned, IF is actually a very broad term for a multitude of different protocols. And with each day, it seems like there's a new protocol that someone decides to come up with for some reason. But there are a few main ones that we see. So I'm going to touch on those here. First off, we see ADF, or it actually stands for alternate day fasting. Now, this is by far the most common one you'll see in the literature. And just a little side note, we are kind of excluding religious fasting like Ramadan fasting and such, because with those, there's some various issues with that literature that we're not really going to talk about that under the umbrella of intermittent fasting. So in terms of research, intermittent fasting, these are the main ones we're going to see. So ADF, alternate day fasting, once again, sounds kind of like what it is, where participants will on a day one, essentially, they'll eat like normal, do whatever they do. Day two, no food, no calories, nothing. Day three, go back to eating like normal, and then just alternate feed days and fast days in perpetuity. Now, sounds fun, right? Where on average, we're having people fast, 36 to 40 hours pretty much every other day. Well, as you can imagine, there could potentially be some issues with that. So they came up with this other form of it called modified alternate day fasting. And which in modified alternate day fasting, instead of completely fasting on that second day, they'll have a small meal, typically about 300 to 500 calories, or about 25 to 30% of baseline calories. And they'll have that around lunchtime on that fast day. So they're splitting that one super long fast into two smaller fasts. And that's been found to kind of help not only with compliance, but also potentially help with like lean mass maintenance and such. Next, we have whole day fasting. Whole day fasting, you don't see a ton in the literature actually, but the reason I bring it up is it's easily the second most common one that you'll come across out in the field. And with this one, the hallmark of it is 1 to 2 times per week, a participant will fast for 24 continuous hours. But one of the big differences between alternate day fasting and whole day fasting, besides just whole day fasting is only 1 or 2 times a week versus alternate day fasting is every other day, a person is still able to eat every single day on whole day fasting. So an example of that might be, say, on day 1, the person will eat until 4:30, 5 o'clock, have a pretty early dinner, then fast continuously until the next day at about 4:30, 5 o'clock, and then eat dinner, maybe a nighttime snack, something like that. And so they're still able to eat a fair bit every other day, but it's every day, but it's much less extreme than something like alternate day fasting. Then we come to time-restricted feeding. We'll talk a lot more about time-restricted feeding throughout the majority of this presentation. And this is actually going to be what 99% of the population thinks about when you say intermittent fasting. We have to ask ourselves, though, with anything like this, there's always going to be issues. And so think about, so far up to this point, the vast majority of the literature is in alternate day fasting and modified alternate day fasting. Well, when we're asking people to continually and very, very regularly fast for on average anywhere from 36 to 40 hours, we might have some issues with compliance. And that has been shown time and time again with a lot of these studies having dropout rates that are pretty regularly 40% and above. And one of the things to think about for that is that whenever we think about any kind of dietary approach, one reason, aside from just can the person, grit through it, but how much is this affecting their outside life? For instance, social implications. We'll talk about this again when we talk about early versus delayed time restricted feeding. But social implications, if you're telling somebody they can't eat every other day, or even if the modified alternate day fasting, they're only having lunch on those days. So they can't go home and have dinner with their family. They can't go out after work and hang out with their friends. And how much does food play a role in all of our social interactions nowadays? So unless you want to be that weird person sitting at the end of the table not eating while everyone else is out, and I've been there, it's not fun, it's going to be hard to adhere to these long term. So in comes time restricted feeding. Now, what actually is time restricted feeding? The hallmark of this particular dietary strategy is daily shorter fasts. And when I say shorter fasts, I'm talking about fasts that range anywhere from about 12 to 21 hours on average. And the most common ones you'll see of this are the 16 and 8 protocol, also dubbed the lean gains diet, in which a participant will fast for 16 hours and then eat for 8 hours. Or a 20 and 4 protocol is probably the second most popular, in which someone will fast for 20 hours and then eat for 4 hours. So examples of this may be on a 16 and 8, a person will only eat between noon and 8 p.m. Or on a 20 and 4, a person may only eat from 4 to 8 p.m. and be fasting the rest of the day. Now, some of the benefits of this is we tend to see higher adherence rates for this. Not only because it's easier that you only have to fast for that shorter period of time, but it's disrupting people's daily life less. Especially if we think about it, if we move that eating window to later in the day, then they're still able to go home, have dinner with their family, go out with their friends, essentially have like normal weekends and still keep food around, the social aspect isn't affected around food. Also, when people are fasting, primarily during the beginning of the day, for a lot of people, that's when they're at work and their mind's on work, not necessarily being hungry and not being able to eat. So in general, it usually kind of ties everything up to be a fair bit easier for people. And that's one of the reasons why we really started to see these different fasting protocols get really big in the media. And popularity really started to rise towards the late 2000s when we saw Martin Berkham come out with the lean gains method. And then it actually even got so popular that, as we see kind of right here, some editors at Men's Health decided to basically rip off everything that he put on his website and put it in a diet, and they called it the 8-hour diet and published it. And that kind of sparked a trend where then later we saw the 20 and 4 published by Ori Hofmeckler with the Warrior Diet, which, funny enough, if you actually read through that book, he never really talks about 20 and 4, but that is always where it's attributed to. And as well as other diets like Eat, Stop, Eat by Brad Pilon, which was one of the first ones that popularized whole day fasting, as well as like the 5-2 diet is another kind of emerging one. That's kind of a modified whole day fast where 2 non-consecutive days out of the week, a participant will only eat about 500 calories. So kind of that mixture of modified alternate day fasting and whole day fasting. And as we can see here, like all these books, every other day, it seems like more and more is popping up. So if we are anyone who's worked with anybody can tell you the hardest thing to do is get people to put the fork down. So why is it so popular that we have a dietary practice that is entirely around no forks, no food? Well, when we dive into the literature, it kind of gives us a little bit of an idea why. A lot of the previous literature shows benefits for improving things like glucose homeostasis, cardiometabolic markers, even independent of weight loss. And that's a really interesting paper we'll talk about towards the end. And then when we look at body composition, because I work in a body composition lab, so I'm always going to be interested in that. In general, we see people decrease body mass, total body mass by about, on average, about 3 to 7%. And in just body fat, about 3 to 5.5 kilograms. So if we can convert that to good old freedom units, then 12 pounds of body fat loss, just body fat loss on average, just by following some of these protocols. But as scientists, we have to ask not only what happens, but why it happens. And we see that this happens primarily through we're just tricking people into eating less. And so subsequent food intake during the feeding window does not make up for the calories they miss during the fasting period. People don't overeat enough during the feeding window to make up all those calories they missed. And this has been shown time and time again throughout the literature. For instance, if we start off going all the way back 18 years ago to Johnstone in 2002, in which they showed that after a 36-hour fast, participants only increased energy intake, so increased calorie content of a meal at the first meal after they broke their fast. Similarly, a couple years later, Stowe 2007, they actually even attempted, like really attempted to try to make it isocaloric by having participants eat all the food with the researchers. Everything was observed. They fed the participants all the meals as a way to try to really look at what happens when you compare 3 meals per day to 1 meal over a 4-hour window. And even when doing all that, participants in the 1 meal over that 4-hour period still ate on average 65 calories less per day. And when they interviewed them, all the participants mentioned that if it had been up to them, they would have eaten even less, because they were essentially force feeding themselves to even get to that 65 calories less per day. And some more recent examples, we'll talk about this paper in pretty good detail here coming up as well, but the Tinsley 2017 paper, in which once again, their 4-hour feeding window days, participants ate 650 calories less per day than they did when they weren't fasting. And one of the most recent examples is going to be this Jones 2020 paper that came out a couple of weeks ago, that even in an 8-hour feeding window, participants still ate 400 calories less per day. But once again, all that's cool. But so far, we haven't mentioned anything about exercise. We've just talked about general weight loss and general fat loss. But this is the International Society of Sports Nutrition. We're worried about what's going to happen in terms of exercise, performance, all that fun stuff. Well, to answer that question, it's time to science. So here are the only 4 papers published to date that use time-restricted feeding, or even intermittent fasting in general, and a resistance training intervention. There's one other one in alternate day fasting and cardio, where they used an elliptical in clinical populations. But in terms of healthy populations, time-restricted feeding, and resistance training at all, these are the only 4 to date. So we can still see it's a pretty sparse, kind of budding topic that we're still trying to find out a lot about. Now we're going to start off, like I mentioned, with weight loss, and specifically fat loss. So remember, there's that difference there. And because 99% of the time when someone does this protocol, they're doing it because they're trying to lose fat. So are you going to lose fat? Is it more beneficial, like a lot of the YouTube says it is? Well, let's find out. And we're going to start off with the Moro 2016 paper, the paper that launched 1,000 fasts. And this, even to date, this is still kind of a controversial paper, and we'll see why. But this was the very first paper ever published using time-restricted feeding and resistance training. You can see it was only 4 years ago. But why did it get so popular? Well, let's take a look. They got 34 participants that were males, so 34 male participants, and that all had at least 5 years of resistance training experience. So pretty well-trained people. And they put them in one of two groups, either a time-restricted feeding group where they followed that 16 and 8 protocol that we talked about. So just a reminder, that means 16 hours fasting, 8 hours feeding. And they tried to have them eat all their meals at 1 p.m., 4 p.m., and 8 p.m., compared to a control in which their meals were spread out at 8 a.m., 1 p.m., and 8 p.m. And they attempted to make it isocaloric. The reason I say attempted is because, like all these studies, we have to remember these are free living studies. Participants were not eating in the lab, they were not living there, so it's not metabolic wards, so we essentially have to take them at their word. And they also had a pretty good protein intake, 1.9 grams per kg of protein per day, which once again, equal between groups. Also, the really interesting part about this paper is that despite most people trying to use this protocol to lose weight, they were attempting to not have the participants lose weight. They wanted to try to put people at maintenance and then see what happens. So then they had them come in, supervised resistance training 3 times a week for 8 weeks. And they got all of this lovely data. Well, we're here to focus on body comp. Specifically for this part, fat mass. So let's look at the fat mass. This is why this paper got so popular and is the paper that everyone will pull up on Twitter if you ever get into an argument about intermittent fasting. The normal diet group, no difference in fat mass. The time-restricted feeding group or the intermittent fasting group actually did lose fat mass. Interesting. Well, we know as scientists, we can't just look at one paper. We have to put the paper in context with all the other papers around it. So we need to replicate things, see if that really happens, and consistently. Well, what do the other papers say? We're going to jump forward a little bit, a couple years to 2019, in which a paper by that my boss published that they were doing while I was conducting another investigation with Trish at Kennesaw that we'll talk about here in a second. So since it was by my boss, everyone's going to tell him I said it was awesome, right? Okay, now that we got that out of the way, we can dig into it. So, but I will say that actually the really cool thing about this one is we know there's usually a plethora of research in males. To date, this is the only one that actually looked at resistance training females. And so they got 24 female subjects that had at least 1 year of resistance training experience and put them into one of 3 groups. Either, once again, 16 and 8, a 16 and 8 time-restricted feeding group, a 16 and 8 time-restricted feeding group with HMB, or a control group. And the control was just eat when you wake up, eat your normal eating pattern throughout the day, and you're good. Then, unlike Moro, which they tried to put them at maintenance, Tinsley tried to actually have them in a very, very slight caloric deficit, only about 250 calories, which how they defined that was they determined their resting metabolic rate and then multiplied it by an activity factor of 1.5, subtracted 250 calories from that, and said, don't eat above this. And the idea behind that was they actually were hoping to see some body recomposition so that weight actually wouldn't change that much, but we see fat loss and a little bit of muscle mass gain. Now also notice that I said they told them to not eat above this. I didn't say they said to eat this, because essentially what it came down to was they said as long as you're eating in the windows that we told you to eat and you're eating enough protein and you're not eating more than the amount of calories that we told you to eat, we're good. We're Gucci. So that'll come into play here when we look at the results. So let's look at that. Specifically, fat mass again. Now, quick little rundown what's happening here. When we look at it, we see here is going to be baseline, 4 weeks, and 8 weeks. And they use, since this is coming out of our lab, we always use a full 4-compartment model, not just plain DEXA. Now, when we look at changes, it looks pretty interesting, pretty similar to, say, the Moro paper, in which the control group gained a little bit of weight, the TRF group lost a little bit of weight, and then the TRF with HMB lost even a little bit of more weight. Well, when we dive into the paper even a little bit more, we can kind of see why. So let's look at actually what they ate during, or at least what they reported that they ate during the intervention. Throughout it, we see the group that ate the most calories gained a bit of weight. Then the group that ate the least amount of calories lost the most weight. Shocking, I know. Calories in equals calories out equals changes in fat loss. Shocking stuff. But this once again kind of shows us that putting people on these different protocols, we're getting people to eat less calories. That brings us to the one that our group at Kennesaw, when I was at Kennesaw, conducted. And what we decided to do is we looked at all those previous interventions and said, these are all really cool, really great. But what would happen if we actually really, really controlled things? So the only difference between people is going to be the eating pattern. So we set out to look at that. And we got 32 college-age males and who had at least 6 months of resistance training experience and put them in 2 groups. Once again, that's 16 and 8, or a control group, which was just like the Tinsley study. Control group was just eat when you wake up in the morning and then eat normally throughout the day. And we put them in a 25% caloric deficit. So far, we are the only paper that our goal was actually to cause significant weight loss. Remember the Moro paper, they wanted them to maintain weight. The Tinsley paper, they were shooting for recomp. So very little change in body weight, but ideally a little bit of fat mass loss, a little bit of muscle gain. And we also then put them on a 1.8 grams per kg per day of protein. So similar to the other two, we did 4 weeks instead of 8 weeks. But we still use supervised resistance training. So people came in, we watched them do every single rep of every single set. I got really good at counting to 8 while watching this. What happened at the end of 4 weeks? Well, when we used once again, we used a full 4-compartment model. When we look at changes in fat mass, no difference between any of the groups. So they significantly lost fat, but no difference between time-restricted feeding or control. And it's the same thing when we look at changes in body fat percentage. Decreases, but equal decreases in both groups. And this shows up again, even if we don't just look at the raw numbers, if we look at percent changes, whether we're looking at fat mass, it was exactly the same, or body fat percentage, exactly the same changes. And this was all because we controlled calories. So no difference between calorie intake between groups, as well as no difference between protein, carbohydrates, fat, any aspect of the diet, no difference between groups. So this shows us essentially what's going on when you have an exact diet, especially in a shorter time period like a lot of people might use and say cutting for meat or something like that, like a powerlifting meet, weight restricted sport athletes, that kind of thing. Now we're going to jump back to the one other Tinsley study, Tinsley 2017. And this one, I will admit, when I first read this paper, I was just kind of like, how did this win paper of the year in EJSS? And then the more I dived into it, the more I realized how actually interesting and cool this paper actually is. So once again, you can tell my boss I said his paper was good. Now, the reason is because this paper had a different goal than a lot of the ones we've talked about. This one was essentially purely behavioral. It was mostly, we're going to tell people to follow these eating protocols and to exercise. We're not going to tell them anything else. We just want to see what happens. What do people eat? How much do people eat? How much do people change their behavior? That kind of thing. And so they got 24 male participants who had at least 1 year of resistance experience and put them into 2 groups. And so this is also the first one that isn't using a 16 and 8. They actually used a 20 and 4. So 20 hours fasting, 4-hour feeding window. However, they did use a little bit of a modified 20 and 4. So it wasn't a straight 20 and 4 every single day. They only did the 4-hour feeding windows on days that they didn't train. So participants did unsupervised training 3 days per week. So 3 days per week, they ate like normal. And then 4 days per week, did the 4-hour feeding window. And then followed that for 8 weeks, and then came in and they assessed body composition via DEXA. Well, what happened? Well, when we look at fat mass, even though this didn't reach statistical significance, and it does look like a little bit more change than it actually was because we're looking at percent changes, we still see some interesting trends going on here. So we have to ask ourselves, what is the underlying reason? Because once again, we always have to know why. It's not enough to know what happens. And when they looked at the dietary records, the TRF group on average ate 650 kcals less per day on fasting days. So that gives us a little bit of better understanding of why we started seeing that. So kind of wrapping all of fat loss up, essentially, I hope you kind of got out of it that despite some early interesting findings with IF, in more controlled settings, we can kind of see that the fat loss benefits of intermittent fasting are primarily due to tricking people into eating less. And so when we control for diet, it's you still see fat loss, but it's not more advantageous than just caloric restriction alone. Now, that's cool about fat loss. What about trying to get jacked? We're losing fat so that, you know, we can look good when we go to the beach whenever it gets warm again and it's not 30 degrees like it was here in Lubbock this morning. Well, let's find out. So we're going to dive back into those papers again, but instead of looking at fat mass, let's look at the fun stuff with muscle. So going back to Moro 2016, just a quick reminder, you know, all participants had 5 years of resistance training experience, 16 and 8. 34 participants undergo 8 weeks of supervised resistance training 3 times per week. Now when we look again at the body composition, instead of looking at fat mass, let's look at fat-free mass. No differences. Whether they were fasting, whether they were not fasting, no differences. Now, I might also wonder about why there were no increases as well either. Also, keep in mind, this is a pretty well-trained population. So they've been training heavy resistance training for at least 5 years. So in those kind of populations, you might not see as big of a change versus if we're looking at populations in which they've only been training for 6 months or a year or something like that. That kind of makes sense. But interestingly enough, still no changes, despite only eating for 8 hours out of the day. Going back to our paper at Kennesaw, similar thing when we look at fat-free mass. No differences, no gains either, but we maintained. And remember, this is only 4 weeks. In 4 weeks, you're not really going to see a ton of gain. And 4 weeks, especially at a 25% calorie deficit. But this shows that even when eating like that, you're still at least maintaining fat-free mass. And this shows up again, even when we look at percent changes. No differences. Going in to the Tinsley paper where we're looking at females. So far we've talked a lot about males, but what's happening with females? Now let's dive back in here, but looking at fat-free mass instead. Especially if we look at changes. Positive, good changes. Even females we're seeing gaining, a kilo of fat-free mass in 8 weeks. I mean, I don't know what resistance training female wouldn't like to see 2 pounds of muscle gain in 8 weeks. That's outstanding. And it was no different than the control diet group. So showing Once again, so far, no difference, no difference, no difference. What about that last paper where it essentially said just what happens when you tell people to do this? We're not going to try to control diet at all or anything. We're just going to tell people to eat 4 hours a day on non-training days. What happens? Well, we looked at lean soft tissue. When they looked at lean soft tissue for that, they did, once again, it didn't reach significance for the differences here, but we're approaching something. And at least we see in the TRF, there's still maintenance going on. But why do we see such a difference? We always have to ask ourselves that. And it comes down to the protein. All about the protein. In the first 3 studies, protein was equated. Moro, we had 1.9, Tinsley 1.65. In our paper, it was 1.83. And all of these are above that 1.6 recommendation based off the Morton 2017 meta-analysis. Versus if we talk about that Tinsley paper in which just what happens, you see the TRF group ate only 1 gram per kg per day, as opposed to the normal diet group ate 1.4 grams per kg per day. And that might not seem like that big of a difference, but in the protein world, that's pretty significant. Especially if we go back to some of the old Stuart Phillips recommendations where they said for strength and power athletes, a minimum of 1.2, or even the bottom of that 95% confidence interval from the Morton meta-analysis as well said 1.2 grams per kg per day. And only one of those 2 groups was meeting that. So this tells us once people start following these protocols, unless they're focused on getting their protein in, they're going to self-select to eat less protein. So we have to make sure to really be counseling people, make sure you get your protein in, make sure you get your protein in, because we want to make sure we're maintaining that fat-free mass. So they maintain fat-free mass, but what good is looking good if you can't perform good as well? Because if you're in my world, that looking good is only half the part of it. You still got to perform on the platform. Well, in terms of upper body strength, here's the findings for all 4 studies that looked at this, these 4 papers that we've been talking about today. I will say that I've only put the time-restricted feeding results on here, not only because that's the topic, but also none of the papers found any differences between any of the performance metrics between the controlled diet and the time-restricted feeding diets. And so we still see increases in upper body strength measured by bench press 1 RM, similar increases in lower body strength, which everyone measured with leg press 1 RM. Now I will say with endurance, this is where things get a little interesting, because in the 2019 paper, for upper body endurance, only the Tinsley 2019 paper showed increases in endurance. But then when looking at lower body endurance, both Tinsley papers showed increases, and our paper was the only one that didn't show increases. Now, a good explanation for ours not showing increases in either is likely due to the training program that we had them do. So for example, in the main list of bench press and leg press, we never had them go above 8 reps because we were trying to get them stronger. And so good old specificity principle. If you're not training for endurance, are you likely going to see increases in endurance? Also, another main difference between our paper and those 2 Tinsley papers is the length of time. Ours was only 4 weeks versus their 2 were 8 weeks. And I noticed I left the Morton off of this because, the Moro paper off of these 2 for endurance because Moro did not assess endurance. So endurance was only assessed by Tinsley and our paper. So we can kind of wrap that up about IF does not necessarily inhibit maintenance of fat-free mass or performance, but it didn't help it either. So keep that in mind. Like it didn't inhibit it, but it didn't help it. Now I'd be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about this growing trend in the fasting world of early versus late time-restricted feeding. And the idea behind this comes down to eating with circadian rhythm. So there's some arguments for that if we shift our feeding windows to earlier in the day, we're eating more with our circadian rhythm, so we might see some more beneficial aspects of it. And this all started with the Sutton 2018 paper that came out of Courtney Peterson's lab at UAB, who does a lot of really good work on early time restricted feeding. And so this was the first paper that proposed this. So I want to go over it really quickly so you can see why. What they did was they started with 12, but they ended with 8 participants that were obese, pre-diabetic males. So obese, pre-diabetic males that underwent either an early time restricted feeding or a control diet for 5 weeks, then had a 7-week washout period, then flipped diets. And it was really well controlled. They fed them. So all participants ate all the food in the presence of the researchers again, and they only ate food that was provided to them by the researchers. And essentially at the end of the full investigation, what happened? Well, they looked at a lot of different cardiometabolic measures, as well as things like oral glucose tolerance test. And what they found was no difference in glucose measures, but the participants were becoming more insulin sensitive. So less insulin to do the same thing with glucose. And similar improvements when they looked at various cardiometabolic markers, whether it was blood pressure, so decreases in systolic and diastolic blood pressure. No changes in cholesterol, so this difference was actually by a drop in control cholesterol, in the cholesterol in the control group. And then actually did see an increase in triglycerides. However, they did kind of explain that that could potentially be an interaction, mostly due to the fasting window, because the early time restricted feeding group ended up fasting for 18 hours before blood collection for all of these metrics, versus the control group only fasted for 12 hours before collection for all these metrics. But especially when we're cutting off food intake so early, which in this study, participants stopped eating by 3 p.m. So they did a 6-hour window and they stopped eating by 3 p.m. So we have to look at hunger. Well, when they looked at that, they did see a decrease in not only desire to eat in the evening, but also capacity to eat in the evening. So when they did eat in the evening, they were unable to eat as much because the same amount of food, or roughly about the same amount of food, made them feel fuller. And that they attributed that to potentially some interactions with some of appetite hormones, such as peptide YY and such, as you can see. But the thing that we can kind of take from that is not necessarily early time restricted feeding does all this great stuff. Remember, it was just early time restricted feeding versus a control group. So we can't say, is it early time restricted feeding or is it just time restricted feeding in general? And so when we ask that question, sadly to date, there are only 2 studies actually looking at early versus delayed time restricted feeding. And both of these studies, the longest that they've been is 1 week. There's not a lot we can tell about long-term effects or benefits of this after only 1 week of one of these protocols. Another big thing that we have to always think about when we're talking about early time restricted feeding, even if there are benefits to it, like they showed in the Sutton paper where they had all those benefits even despite the participants not losing weight. Can people stick to this? That's the question we have to ask with any kind of dietary protocol, because we don't care necessarily if someone can do this for 5 weeks. We care if someone can do this for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the line. And I've heard a lot of people out of John Hawley's lab out of Australia, who they also do some work with early time restricted feeding, mention when they're interacting with the participants are often saying, well, can I eat a little bit later in the day so that way I can at least get home, have dinner with my family and such. And so maybe could I push my window back to finishing at 6 or 7 or 8? And if we're pushing it back that far, essentially, you're just doing now normal time restricted feeding. You're no longer doing early time restricted feeding. So is it really going to be that beneficial if we can't have a lot of people stick to it long term? That's one of the questions you have to ask when deciding, do you want to essentially skip dinner or do you want to skip breakfast? So trying to put a little summary here together. In terms of body composition, now I grouped the studies. So on the left side of your screen, we have the Moro paper and our paper, which are a little bit more calorie controlled, as well as the two Tinsley papers on the right, which are more less calorie controlled and more just looking at general behavior of when you put people on these different interventions. And we can see that in general, there were, for 3 out of 4 papers, no difference between the two groups in changes in body mass. There was a little bit more disagreement in fat mass, but remember those difference in fat masses in IF for at least the Tinsley paper were driven by the IF groups eating significantly less calories than the normal diet group. Fat mass, this is the easy one where all of us agree. Maintenance of fat mass, no changes between fat-free mass between IF or normal diet, same. If you eat enough protein, train hard, you'll keep your muscle mass. Body fat percentage essentially went the way of fat mass. So in general, we see it kind of goes with caloric intake. Performance, this is where things get a lot easier. We show that you can still increase lower body strength, so you can still get those nice legs, increase your squat, increase bench press strength. Endurance, no changes between the two. Most of the studies show that you can still increase endurance if the training protocol is designed for that. And then upper body endurance, pretty much the same idea. Now we have to ask, how are you going to use this? So we've just spent the last 45 minutes talking about all these different aspects of intermittent fasting. But how are you going to implement it with your clients, or when your students want to implement it with that, or friends or your family are going to come in? Things we have to keep in mind with this is it's just like any other dietary protocol. It is a tool in the toolbox. So we have to pull it out when that tool makes sense. So it's likely going to be best when people are trying to lose weight. Because why would we want to put somebody under a protocol that typically tricks people into eating less when they're trying to gain weight and essentially just make it harder for them? Also, we have to keep the client in mind. What I mean by that is, does the person even enjoy eating this way? If the person doesn't enjoy eating this way, everything pretty much shows that they get the same results if they control calories and protein. So have them eat in a way that they enjoy. But if they do enjoy eating this way, because in those kind of reduced feeding windows, they can have larger meals a little bit more frequently, feel fuller during that period of time, then go forth and be happy. Enjoy it. The big kind of take-home picture here is that how the main underpinning of intermittent fasting is that it gets people to selectively decrease energy intake in uncontrolled conditions. But in more controlled conditions, IF does not provide increased fat loss benefits. But it does, you still are able to maintain lean mass and still increase performance with it, as long as you're including things like resistance training and a high enough protein intake. So thank you for listening to me babble on for the last 45 minutes or so. If there's any time for questions, I would be glad to take them now.
Great. Thanks so much, Matt. We absolutely have a few minutes for questions here, and then we'll take a break before Dr. Antonio's talk. We have a question here from Jessica. To maintain that weight loss from IF, would an individual have to adhere to the protocols for the rest of his or her life? What would happen if that individual stopped following the IF protocol? Do you think that intermittent fasting is sustainable for the general population?
All right, so we'll take those a little bit like one at a time. So first off, yep. I would say, is the weight loss sustainable? The weight loss is definitely sustainable as long as you maintain the same calorie intake and activity level that you were following during intermittent fasting. So there's nothing saying that you have to continue intermittent fasting, because if intermittent fasting was essentially just getting you to eat a lower caloric intake. So as long as you maintain that, you'll maintain the weight loss. However, if you go off of intermittent fasting and then start going back to your old habits and increasing caloric intake back to where you were when the person was heavier, then you're going to see the weight come back on. Now, is it sustainable for the majority of people? Once again, that's going to come down to individual level. Like for me, I've found it pretty easy to eat this way. I know a lot of people that kind of fall into that as well, because it's essentially, you don't really have to worry about too much food when you're at work, busy all day, all that kind of stuff. You're not worried about shoving your face. And it's nice because then you can kind of come home and have a nice big dinner because you got a lot of extra calories left. But I know a ton of people that didn't like it. For instance, in our paper that I conducted at Kennesaw, I remember a lot of the participants said they just didn't like it. So they actually didn't mind doing the caloric deficit. They just hated having to wait till noon or 1 p.m. to eat. So for those people, it's absolutely not going to be sustainable. So sustainability is really going to come down to the individual and just, do they enjoy eating that way? Some people are going to enjoy eating that way. Some people aren't going to enjoy eating that way. And so the whole trick with this is just finding what dietary approach you enjoy. And I think there was a third part of that I missed, that I forgot. Did I get all of it?
I think you're good. Yeah, I think you're good. She had a follow-up kind of, what population would you recommend intermittent fasting for? So is, exercising women, exercising men, elite, non-elite? Any thoughts on that?
So I would kind of the same answer that I put before, where I would mostly just recommend it for people that enjoy eating this way. I wouldn't really recommend it for people who are in periods of the year where they might be trying to gain weight. Because like we mentioned, it's harder to fit the same amount of calories in that window. And so it's already hard to fit calories in when you're going to be in a caloric surplus. Why would you want to make it harder on yourself? Also, while we see maintenance of fat-free mass, you are kind of flying in the face of most nutrient, especially protein timing recommendations about protein pacing throughout the day. So if you're trying to really gain muscle mass, it might be more beneficial to not necessarily do this and give your body every potential chance it has to stimulate muscle protein synthesis, blunt muscle protein breakdown, and build muscle. Even though, just like Dr. Ferrando talked about yesterday, the main thing that matters is getting all your daily protein intake in, like throughout the day. So for most people, that should be what matters. As long as you get it in, you get it in. But the question is, why not? You're not going to hurt yourself if you're eating it more frequently throughout the day.
How about children and adolescents? Any research on children in fasting, or would you recommend this type of diet for a younger athlete, high school athlete?
In terms of athletes, one thing I would really caution about is you'd have to look at where you're putting the window if you wanted them to follow this type of protocol. And what I mean that is, especially if we're talking about, say, like high school athletes, they're going to have practices and stuff throughout the day. Sometimes with, say, various ones, it might be before school, it might be after school, it might be both. And ideally, we want people to be exercising in a fed state. So if you can fit it in so that they're still eating and having good peri-training nutrient timing, then I wouldn't see necessarily too much of a harm in it. But the question that we always have to ask is, why do you want to do this? So are they in a period of the training year where they're trying to bring weight a little bit down? Are they trying to maintain? Is fasting really going to be that beneficial for them? Because especially that young active population, we're not really having to worry about things like cardiometabolic dysregulation. We're not worrying about pre-diabetics a lot of times, or high blood pressure or something like that, that these various protocols have been shown to benefit with fasting. So if we're dealing with healthy populations, I would mostly just say, if you're going to fast, try to put your exercise in that feeding window, and only do it when you think it's actually going to be really beneficial. So once again, it just comes down to context.
30-second answer here, and then we'll take a break. Do you think